Here's a famous example of one of these note collisions. It's from the Coventry Carol, though it's got nothing to do with a nice girl from the Midlands.
Child, bye bye, little tiny child, bye bye, little.
This is what happens. The soprano singing the tune has to sing these two notes. Because they're clearly heading in an upwards direction, they've been squeezed up or sharpened. But at the same time, the tenor, who sings on the same rung of the ladder, is heading downwards, so his note has to be left flattened.
Bye bye, Lully.
And together, the sharp and the flat notes have to be sung simultaneously, creating what to modern ears sounds like a weird discord, but to Tudor ears was an oral delicacy. They even gave it a saucy name, false relations.
Bye bye, Lully.
Though the deliberate collisions and scrunches eventually died out, folk musicians in the British Isles never really lost their love of these modified modes. What's more, another group of musicians unwittingly came up against this same variable rung principle 300 years later and 4,000 miles across the Atlantic. They were the early pioneers of the blues. Listen to this song by Blind Lemon Jefferson, one of the founders of the blues, in a 1926 recording of Long Lonesome Blues.
I walk from Dallas, I walk from Wichita.
I know the recording's old and scratchy, but something very significant is happening in that singing. Blind Lemon Jefferson is making some of the notes bend downwards slightly. He's flattening them. These are some of the earliest preserved examples of a phenomenon known as blue notes. Without the blue notes, his first phrase would sound like this. I walked from Dallas, I walked to Wichita Falls. But he sings, I walked to Wichita Falls. He doesn't bend down all the notes, just the ones on the syllables walked and Wichita. Here he is again, and listen out for the way the notes seem to sag down on those two words.
I walk from Dallas, I walk from Wichita Falls.
Why are these notes bent downwards and not the rest? Indeed, why do it at all? The blues developed in rural America, but their melodic patterns had African roots. In particular, it's the use of blue notes, which fall outside the Western melodic ladder, that link the Tudor rebels to the early blues composers. They too preferred a variable rung on their ladder, but instead of going for an either-or approach to the offending notes, they went for a bendy rung option instead. The blues mode always squeezes the rung down. It's neither this note nor this note. It's the note in between. We'll be coming back to the changes in American melody brought about by blue notes, but first we'll look at the music that came in between the Tudor rebels and the blues. Classical music. In the next part, I'm going to look at the melodic revolution brought about by classical music and how we are still writing tunes according to those changes, no matter what our musical background. Composers in the time of Shakespeare, as we've seen, began to find the medieval modes they'd inherited increasingly inflexible. Plus, there was a kind of snobbery thing creeping into music which separated the music that toffs listened to from the songs and dances that ordinary people enjoyed.
So as the 17th century drifted into the 18th, a new system for upper crust music duly emerged. Partly its job was to get rid of all those ambiguities and collisions that Tudor composers were so fond of, and partly its job was to make a system where all instruments and all singers could play together, to create a kind of standard for European music. It's sometimes called diatonic, and this is how it worked.
At its core lay one simple idea, to take one or two of the old modes and make them the pattern for all music. Like all takeover bids, it involved a couple of mergers. They took parts of the old Dorian and Aeolian modes, merged them into one, borrowed a detail from the Tudors, and hey presto, they had the new, all-purpose minor scale. The detail they borrowed from the Tudors was that rule about sharpening or raising the penultimate note in the musical ladder if it was heading in an upward direction, just like in the Coventry Carol. The arrival of the all-purpose minor scale had two big advantages over its modal predecessors. The first was that the same arrangement of notes worked no matter what note or pitch you started your scale on. So I could start a minor scale on this note, G, or I could start it on this note, E. Wherever you start your melody, the new minor can cope because its pattern is unchanged and fixed. The old modes were much more attached to their chosen starting points. The new minor can start on any of the 12 semitones of the Western ladder. Why does this matter? Well, because in those days most of the instruments they had, keyboards, flutes, trumpets, horns, etc., could only play in certain modes. They could only play a limited number of notes. It was as if all the instruments spoke different languages that had developed separately and they couldn't easily communicate with each other or play together. So having a minor scale that worked the same no matter what note you started on allowed 18th century manufacturers to make instruments that could speak the same language, that could play together. This was the second big gain of the new system. But so far we've only had the sad and solemn minor scale. Happy got the major scale, which was identical to the old Ionian mode with a new name. It was rebranded. What's more, the new major scale and the new minor scale were designed to be totally compatible with each other. You could go from major to minor in the same piece of music as much as you liked. This was a great bonus. The Christmas carol God Rest You Merry Gentlemen does just that. It starts in the key of E minor, all earnest and churchy sounding. God rest you merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay, for Jesus Christ our Saviour was born upon this day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. But when we get to the tidings of comfort and joy, the happy bit, we slink effortlessly into the key of G major. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Finally, just to remind us we shouldn't get too carried away with our Yuletide jollity, at the very end we slink back into the original key of E minor. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Composers love to exploit their ability to rock between major and minor, to glide about all over the place in the full knowledge that the system was strong enough to handle any change of gear or maneuver.